There is a story almost everyone knows. You do not need to have grown up in a church to have heard it. You do not need to own a Bible or remember the last time you opened one. Somewhere, at some point, the image found you. An old woman, very poor, standing near a collection box at the temple, dropping in 2 small coins, the smallest coins in circulation, worth almost nothing by any measure the world would recognize. And yet, the story goes, what she gave was worth more than everything the wealthy donors had given combined, because she gave everything she had. She held nothing back. That is the story as most people carry it. It is a story about sacrifice being more valuable than surplus, about God noticing what the world overlooks, about a woman with nothing offering the only thing she had left, and that offering being honored above the grand, visible contributions of the rich and the powerful. It is, by almost any emotional measure, a beautiful story. It has moved people to tears in church pews for centuries. It has sat at the center of sermons about generosity, faithfulness, and what it means to truly trust God with everything you have. Generations of believers have found in it something that felt true and deep, that the widow's 2 coins mattered more than all the gold in the treasury, because love was behind them. There is a reason this story has lasted. There is a reason it gets told the way it gets told. The emotional logic is sound. The theology it seems to convey is coherent on its own terms. The Bible, throughout both Testaments, consistently lifts up the poor, the humble, the unseen. The Psalms are full of a God who hears the cry of the lowly and ignores the pretensions of the powerful. The prophets spoke again and again about justice for widows and orphans, about God's particular attention to those the powerful had written off. The widow with her 2 coins fits into that pattern naturally, almost perfectly. She is easy to love. The story is easy to tell. And for 2,000 years, it largely has been. But here is the question this video is going to ask, and it is a question worth sitting with before you decide you already know the answer. What if the story does not mean what you think it means? Not because the text was corrupted. Not because a hidden manuscript changed everything. Not because some skeptic decided to tear something down, but because the story, as it has almost always been told, has been cut loose from its context, specifically from the passage that comes directly before it in the same chapter, just a few verses earlier. And that passage, the one almost no one reads alongside this story, changes everything about how this scene looks. The words Jesus spoke immediately before watching this woman drop her coins were not words of celebration. They were not the setup for a lesson about generosity. They were a condemnation, a sharp, pointed, specific condemnation of the religious professionals running the very institution this widow was about to give her last coin to. Jesus had just looked at the crowd and warned them about the scribes, the legal and religious authorities of Jerusalem, men who walked around in long robes, who sought the best seats in the synagogues, who performed long prayers while, as Jesus put it, they devoured widows' houses. That was the phrase, they devour widows' houses. And then, in the very next scene, Jesus sits down and watches a widow give her last 2 coins to the institution those men ran. That is the context that has been missing from almost every sermon ever preached on this passage. That is the lens that changes the color of everything. When you read those 6 preceding verses, the widow's offering does not look like a model to be praised. It starts to look like exactly what Jesus was talking about, the end result of a system that had stripped her of everything until all she had left were 2 coins she believed she owed to God. This video is going to walk through all of it. the text itself, verse by verse. The Greek words, because some of them carry far more weight than a translation reveals. The literary structure Mark uses in his Gospel, because it is deliberate and it is important and it reshapes the scene entirely when you see it, the historical context of the temple and who it served and who it consumed. What scholars have argued about this passage, particularly since a landmark article in 1982 that formally challenged the traditional reading on strictly textual grounds. And what all of this means, not just for this passage, but for how the Church has used it, and what it says about how we read Scripture generally. None of this is comfortable. If the traditional reading is wrong, and the evidence that it is ranges from strong to overwhelming, then it has real consequences. It means a passage that has been used for centuries to encourage ordinary people of modest means to give sacrificially to religious institutions has been preached out of context, stripped of its frame, and deployed in a way that serves institutions rather than the people those institutions are supposed to serve. That is a serious thing to say. It deserves to be said carefully and backed up completely, and that is what this is going to do. But before any of that, before the Greek, before the structure, before the scholarship, it helps to return to the scene itself and simply be present in it for a moment. Because something is happening there that is worth feeling before it is analyzed. Jerusalem, the temple complex, a vast colonnaded court open to the sky where Jewish women could enter and pray. Against the walls, 13 large collection chests, their tops shaped like the bells of trumpets, their mouths open to receive offerings. The sound of coins dropping into metal, loud coins, soft coins, rare coins, common coins, wealthy men moving through the crowd, making their contributions, and then a woman, identified by no name, no history, no family, only her status, her poverty, and her 2 coins. She drops them in, and across the courtyard, Jesus is watching. He calls his disciples over. He wants them to see something. He has something to say about what just happened. The question this entire video turns on is whether what he says next is praise or grief, whether he is holding her up as a model or pointing to her as evidence of something gone deeply, terribly wrong. The answer is in the text. It has always been in the text. You just have to read all of it. To understand why the corrected reading matters so much, you first have to understand exactly how the traditional reading works, not as a caricature, but in its strongest, most honest form. Because the traditional reading is not a fraud. It is not a lie invented to manipulate people. It is a reasonable interpretation of the text when that text is read in isolation. It has theological weight, emotional resonance, and a long, serious pedigree. If you are going to argue that it is incomplete, you owe it the respect of engaging it fully first. The standard sermon on the widow's mite follows a recognizable structure. It opens with the contrast. Wealthy donors stream past the treasury chests in the temple court, dropping in large sums. These men are not anonymous. They are visible, probably expected to be visible, giving in a context where giving publicly was woven into the culture of temple worship. Then comes the widow. 2 lepta, the smallest coins available, worth a fraction of a working person's daily wage. And then Jesus speaks. He calls his disciples close and delivers the reversal. All of these people gave out of their surplus, he says, but she gave out of her poverty. She gave everything she had to live on. Therefore, she gave more. The logic of the reversal is what drives the sermon. It is not about absolute amounts. It is about ratios. It is about what the gift cost the giver. The rich man who drops in 100 coins feels nothing. His lifestyle is unchanged, his security is intact, his tomorrow looks exactly like his today. The widow who drops in 2 coins has nothing left. The cost to her is total. And in the economy of the kingdom, Jesus describes throughout the Gospels, cost is the measure of love. This is the same logic that runs through the parable of the prodigal son, through the Beatitudes, through the consistent reversal of worldly status that marks Jesus' teaching everywhere. The last shall be first, the humble shall be exalted, the poor in spirit inherit the kingdom. The widow fits this pattern so naturally that it is almost impossible, on a surface reading, to see her as anything other than the hero of the scene. The 3 pillars of the traditional interpretation are worth naming precisely. The first is comparison. Jesus explicitly compares the widow to the rich donors and elevates her. He is not describing 2 separate things. He is making a direct, evaluative judgment, and the judgment goes in her favor. The second is the language of totality. The phrase, all she had to live on, signals something the Bible consistently treats as morally significant. Total surrender, total trust, holding nothing back. These are qualities the Scriptures associate with faithfulness, from Abraham to the early church. The third is the act of calling the disciples. Jesus deliberately summons his inner circle to witness this moment. In the Gospels, when Jesus does that, it means something. He does not make casual observations. He teaches. And teaching requires a model. She is, on the traditional reading, that model. Serious theologians have built on this foundation. Early church commentators pointed to the widow as an example of perfect abandonment to God, the complete release of earthly security in favor of divine trust. During the Reformation, preachers used her to illustrate that righteousness before God was not about visible greatness, but hidden faithfulness. In modern evangelical tradition, she has become almost synonymous with cheerful, sacrificial giving. The ordinary person of limited means who gives freely, because the gift is oriented toward God rather than toward the calculation of what can be spared. The passage has appeared in the writings of John Chrysostom, in the sermons of Charles Spurgeon, in the devotional literature of virtually every major Christian tradition across 2 millennia. This is not a minor or marginal reading. It is the dominant reading. It has shaped Christian giving culture at its root. And that, precisely, is where the discomfort begins. Because the passage has not merely shaped private devotion, it has been one of the most frequently deployed texts in institutional religious fundraising. It appears in stewardship campaign materials across denominations. It has been cited from pulpits as the scriptural basis for asking congregants, often congregants of modest means, to give sacrificially to their churches. The message is consistent and recognizable. Give like the widow. Don't give from what you have left over. Give first. Give completely. Trust God with the rest. There is nothing inherently cynical about preaching generosity. Generosity is a genuine biblical virtue and a genuine human good. But there is something worth examining in the specific use of this passage. A story about a poor woman giving everything to a religious institution, being used by religious institutions to encourage poor people to give everything. The institutional incentive to maintain this reading is not subtle. When the story is told this way, the institution benefits directly. The widow's sacrifice underwrites the treasury. That does not make the reading wrong on its own. Institutional benefit does not automatically corrupt interpretation, but it does mean the reading deserves more scrutiny than it has historically received. The problem in the end is not that the traditional reading invented something that is not in the text. The problem is that it reads 4 verses while functionally ignoring the 6 that come before them. It treats the widow's offering as a self-contained scene, a complete unit of meaning that requires nothing outside itself to be understood. And the text simply does not cooperate with that approach. Mark did not write these passages in separate chapters. He did not insert a section break or a change of topic between the condemnation of the scribes and the arrival of the widow at the treasury. He placed them side by side in the same breath as part of the same sustained encounter with the temple and its corruption. Reading the widow's offering without the scribe's passage is not a neutral act. It is a choice, and it is a choice with consequences. In Mark's Gospel, there are exactly 6 verses between Jesus finishing his condemnation of the scribes and the widow dropping her 2 coins into the treasury chest. On the physical scroll this text was first written on, that is inches of material. In terms of narrative time, it is a single continuous scene. Jesus speaking, Jesus watching, Jesus speaking again. There is no chapter break in the original text. There is no shift in setting, no new crowd, no journey to a different part of the city. The condemnation and the offering happen in the same place, in the same moment, as part of the same sustained encounter. They are not 2 separate teachings that happen to appear near each other. They are one thing. So what does Jesus say in those 6 verses that almost no one hears before the widow's story begins? He says, "Beware of the scribes. Watch out for the men who walk around in long robes and love to be greeted in the marketplaces, who take the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts. These are the religious authorities of Jerusalem, the scholars, the legal experts, the men who administered the temple system and interpreted the law and held enormous institutional power over ordinary Jewish life." Jesus is not warning against minor infractions. He is not making a gentle observation about vanity. He is publicly, directly, in front of a crowd, condemning the class of men who run the most important religious institution in the world they inhabit. Each element of the description deserves attention. The long robes are not merely a fashion criticism. In 1st century Jerusalem, the length and style of a scribe's robe was a marker of social rank, a visible signal of religious status that ordinary people were expected to recognize and defer to. Walking in these robes was itself a performance, a way of moving through public space in a manner that demanded acknowledgement. The love of greetings in the marketplace is the same instinct made verbal, the desire to be recognized, named, honored in public, to have passers-by confirm their importance through the ritual of greeting. The best seats in synagogues and the places of honor at feasts extend this logic into institutional space. These are men who have arranged the world so that every room they enter organizes itself around their status. They sit at the top, always. And then comes the phrase that changes everything about what follows. They devour widows' houses. The Greek word is katestheusin. It comes from a verb meaning to eat down, to consume completely, to swallow up. This is not the language of passive neglect. It is not describing men who simply fail to help widows. It is describing men who actively consume what widows have, who take it, who use it up, who leave nothing. The verb is vivid and violent, and the object is specific, their houses. Not their coins, not a portion of their income. Their houses, their primary material asset, their shelter, the physical foundation of their survival. The historical mechanism behind this language was well understood by the people hearing it. Scribes in 1st century Judea frequently served as legal administrators and estate trustees for women who had no male representative to manage their affairs. A widow with property, but no son, no brother, no father still living, was structurally dependent on someone with legal standing to act on her behalf. Scribes were among the people positioned to fill that role, and in that position they could charge excessive fees, mismanage estates in ways that benefited themselves, provide bad legal counsel that transferred property into other hands, or simply defraud women who had no recourse because every avenue of recourse ran through the same scribal system. The exploitation was legal. It was dressed up in the language of service, and it was devastating. Jesus says this clearly. He says, "These men consume widows' houses." And then, as if to make the hypocrisy as sharp as possible, he adds the detail that has echoed through Christian preaching ever since, usually attached to prayer, rather than to the indictment it belongs to. They do this for the sake of appearance, while offering long prayers. The longer the prayer, the more righteous they appeared. The more righteous they appeared, the more trust they could extract. The more trust they could extract, the more they could take. The piety was the mechanism of the exploitation. The long prayer was the instrument of the fraud. Jesus closes the condemnation with a line that belongs to the harshest register of his recorded speech. These men, he says, will receive greater condemnation. The Greek is perisoteron krima, a heavier judgment, a judgment beyond the ordinary. This is not mild disapproval. In the Synoptic Gospels, the only passages that rival this kind of language are the woes Jesus pronounces in Matthew 23, where he calls the scribes and Pharisees whitewashed tombs, blind guides, sons of those who murdered the prophets. This is the same temperature. This is Jesus telling a crowd that the men who run the temple are headed for a judgment more severe than most. And immediately, the next verse, the next scene, no gap, no transition, no fresh start, Jesus sits down across from the treasury and watches people drop in their offerings, and a widow comes. A widow. The specific category of person Jesus has just said is being consumed by these men. She comes to the institution these men run, to the treasury they control, and she gives it everything she has left. That is the context. That is what Jesus was looking at when he called his disciples over and made his observation. He had just named, in public, with precise language, the exact class of men whose system this woman was now feeding with her last 2 coins. The question of whether his observation was praise or grief is not close once you read these 6 verses. It is the question the text has been asking all along, waiting for readers to pick up the passage where it actually begins. There is something distinctive about the way Mark tells stories, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. Mark's Gospel is the shortest of the 4. It moves fast, with an urgency the other Gospels do not quite match. His favorite word is immediately, and he uses it over and over, as if the story he is telling is too urgent to pause between scenes. But underneath that speed is a careful, deliberate literary architecture. And one of its most recognizable features is a technique scholars call intercalation, the practice of inserting one story inside another, using the outer story as the interpretive frame for the inner one. Because of its shape, this is sometimes called the Markan sandwich. The pattern works like this. Mark begins a story, interrupts it by inserting a second, apparently different story, and then returns to finish the first. The 2 stories illuminate each other. The outer story provides the context that makes the inner story legible, and the inner story deepens the meaning of the outer. Neither is complete without the other. To read only the filling and ignore the bread is to fundamentally misread what Mark is doing. The most famous example appears in Mark 5. Jairus, a synagogue leader, comes to Jesus in desperation. His daughter is dying, and he begs Jesus to come and heal her. Jesus goes with him. But on the way, a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years reaches through the crowd and touches the hem of Jesus' cloak. Jesus stops. The journey to Jairus' house is interrupted. Jesus heals the bleeding woman, speaks with her, restores her publicly. Only then does the story of Jairus' daughter resume. And now, colored by what just happened, it carries different weight. The outer story and the inner story are in conversation. Mark has placed one inside the other, because that is how he wants you to understand both. He does it throughout the gospel. The story of the fig tree, interrupted by the temple clearing, then resumed, so that the temple's corruption and the fig tree's cursed barrenness interpret each other. The arrest of Jesus interrupted by the naked young man who flees, a detail that seems random until you see it as the inner filling of a larger frame about abandonment and exposure. Intercalation is not an occasional accident in Mark's text. It is one of his primary compositional tools. When you see the pattern, you are being given an instruction. These things belong together. Read them that way. Now look at what surrounds the widow's offering in Mark 12 and 13. The outer story, top piece. Mark 12 verse 38 to 40. Jesus condemns the scribes for devouring widows' houses while performing long prayers for show. He announces they will receive greater condemnation. The inner story, the filling. Mark 12 verse 41 to 44. Jesus watches the widow give her last 2 coins to the temple treasury. He calls his disciples and makes his observation about her gift. The outer story, bottom piece. Mark 13 verse 1 to 2. A disciple marvels at the temple's great stones and grand buildings. Jesus responds immediately. Not one of these stones will be left upon another. All of it will be thrown down. This is the sandwich. The widow's offering is not a standalone scene dropped between 2 unrelated passages. It is the filling between a condemnation of the men who run the temple and a prediction of the temple's total destruction. She is surrounded, in the actual structure of the text, by judgment. And in Mark and intercalation, the outer frame always modifies the inner story. The meaning of what is inside is not fully available without what is outside. Mark has built the interpretive instructions directly into the architecture of the passage. Consider what the bottom piece of bread does to the filling. Immediately after the widow gives everything she has to the temple, a disciple looks up at the massive temple complex and expresses admiration for its grandeur. Jesus' response is absolute and devastating. You see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another. Every stone will be thrown down. This is not a metaphor or a spiritual abstraction. Jesus is predicting the literal, physical destruction of the building that just received the widow's last coin. And he is predicting it in the very next breath, in the very next scene, with no intervening celebration of what the widow just gave. If Jesus were commending the widow as a model of sacrificial giving, the natural next move would be teaching about generosity, an expansion of the lesson, an application, a call to imitate. That is what teachers do when they hold up a positive example. Instead, Jesus pivots directly to the doom of the institution that accepted her gift. There is no sermon on giving. There is a prediction of rubble. The structure of the text is not accidental. Mark is not a careless writer. He has placed these 3 passages together because they belong together, because they are one continuous argument, because the meaning of each is shaped by its neighbors. The condemnation of the scribes tells you what institution this is and what it does to people like this woman. The widow's offering shows you that process reaching its final point. She has nothing left. The temple destruction prediction tells you the outcome. The institution she just gave everything to is finished. It is going to be destroyed. There is no future in which that gift produces anything for her. To extract the widow's offering from this structure and preach it as a model of giving is to perform on the text exactly what the scribes performed on widows. To take something out of its proper context and use it for a purpose it was never meant to serve. It is to read the filling of the sandwich and call it a meal. The bread is not decorative. It is the point. In Mark, it almost always is. At some point, the argument has to come down to the words themselves. Not the structure around them, not the historical background, not the theological tradition. The actual words Jesus spoke, in the language he spoke them in, examined with the precision the text demands. Because the traditional reading and the lament reading are not arguing about what context surrounds the passage. They are arguing about what the passage itself means, and that argument is settled, or at least decisively shaped, by paying close attention to what Jesus actually said and, equally important, what he did not say. The scene begins with a deliberate gesture. The Greek word is proskalestes. Jesus called his disciples to himself. This is an active, intentional summons. He initiates. He interrupts whatever the disciples were doing and draws them close. In Mark's Gospel, this kind of deliberate calling is not casual. Jesus does it when he wants to ensure that what follows registers as a teaching. He is not making an offhand remark. He has something he wants them to see, and he wants them positioned to hear it. The question the entire scene rests on is, what is the lesson? Jesus then says, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury." Stop here for a moment and look at precisely what this sentence does and doesn't do. It establishes a ratio. She gave proportionally more. It makes a comparative judgment. Her gift, measured against her means, exceeds theirs measured against theirs. That is a factual, arithmetical observation. It does not say she gave wisely. It does not say the institution she gave to is worthy. It does not say God is pleased. It does not say the disciples should do likewise. The observation is stated, and then Jesus explains it. For all of them, he says, have contributed out of their abundance. The Greek is perisiontos, from a root meaning to overflow, to have more than enough, to possess surplus. They gave from overflow. Their giving cost them nothing in any meaningful sense. Then the contrast. But she out of her poverty, hysteriseos, from a root meaning to fall short, to be deficient, to lack, has put in everything she had. And here is the word that carries the full weight of the sentence, her whole bios, her whole life, not her whole savings, not her whole wallet. Bios in Greek means life, livelihood, the means by which one sustains existence. It is the same word used when the prodigal son wastes his bios on reckless living. It is the same word used in 1 John when the author asks how anyone can have the world's bios and ignore a brother in need. It means the substance of a life, the material foundation of being alive. Jesus says she gave her whole bios. And 6 verses earlier, he said the scribes, katesthiosin, devour, consume completely widows' houses. The verb of the scribe's action and the noun describing what the widow has surrendered are operating in the same semantic field. They consume. She has nothing left to consume. The linguistic mirror between the two passages is not accidental. Mark has constructed it so that the widow's offering echoes the scribe's condemnation in precise vocabulary. She is the outcome of the process Jesus named. Her empty hands are the end of the sentence that began with their devouring. Now consider with equal care what Jesus does not say. He does not say, "Give like her." He does not say, "She will be blessed." He does not say, "Her gift is pleasing to God." He does not say, "This is what faithfulness looks like." He does not say, "Learn from her example." Every one of those statements would be natural, expected, almost inevitable if this were a teaching moment designed to hold up a positive model. Teachers who want to present a model say, "Do this. Be like this. This is right." Jesus says none of those things. He observes, he states a ratio, he names what she gave, and he stops. This restraint is itself significant. The Hebrew prophetic tradition, which Jesus inhabits entirely and consciously, has a well-established pattern for observing the condition of the poor and stripped. When Amos says that the wealthy trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the earth, he is not praising the poor for being trampled. When Isaiah describes the grinding down of widows and orphans, he is not holding them up as spiritual models of surrender. He is describing an atrocity. The observation of suffering in the prophetic voice is almost always a lament, almost always an indictment of the system producing the suffering. Jesus, speaking in this tradition, making this observation about this woman in this place, is doing what the prophets did. He is saying, "Look at this. Look at what has been done here. Look at what she has left." The formal academic articulation of this reading was published by Addison Wright in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly in 1982. His article, titled simply, "The Widow's Mites, Praise or Lament," argued on strictly textual and structural grounds that the grammar, the vocabulary, the literary context, and the narrative trajectory all point toward lament, and that the praise interpretation cannot be sustained without reading the passage in deliberate isolation from its frame. Wright was not writing polemic. He was doing careful exegesis. His argument has since been engaged by scholars, including Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who extended it within feminist hermeneutics, asking not only what the passage says, but whose interests are served by each reading, and who is made visible or invisible by the interpretive choices involved. The text rewards this kind of attention. Jesus calls his disciples and tells them to look at a woman who has given her whole life sustenance to the institution he just condemned, in the building he is about to predict will be destroyed stone by stone. He states this as a fact. He names the ratio. He names the word bios, and he says nothing else. That silence, the absence of praise, of commendation, of a call to imitate, is not empty. In the context of everything that surrounds it, it is the sound of grief. To fully feel the weight of what Jesus is watching, you need to be able to see the place where he is sitting. The scene is not set in an abstract spiritual space. It is set in a specific architectural location, in a specific city, in a specific institution, with a specific economic structure. The details matter because they make the widow's situation concrete rather than symbolic, and because they make the temple's relationship to people like her legible in ways that pure theological analysis cannot. Jesus is in the court of women, the Ezrat Nashim, a large open courtyard within the temple complex that marked the furthest point Jewish women were permitted to enter. It was a broad, colonnaded space, accessible from the outer courts and functioning as a kind of public gathering area within the sacred precincts. Men could pass through it on their way to the inner courts, but women worshipped here. It was where they prayed, where they brought offerings, where they participated in the communal life of the temple as far as the architecture of exclusion permitted. Along the walls of this court, according to the Mishnah, the codification of Jewish oral law compiled roughly 2 centuries after Jesus, there were 13 collection chests. The Mishnah describes them as shofar-shaped, narrow at the top, widening toward the base, like the bell of a ram's horn inverted. Coins were dropped through the narrow mouth at the top. This shape is significant in a way that deserves a moment's attention. Coins dropped into a narrow metal opening make noise. The sound of giving in this space was audible. Large, heavy coins dropped from height into a metal chest rang out. The wealthy donors moving through the court of women were not giving in silence. The architecture of the treasury made their giving heard. Each of the 13 chests was designated for a specific purpose. Some were for the mandatory half-shekel temple tax, the annual levy paid by every Jewish male as a contribution to the cost of communal sacrifices. Others received voluntary offerings designated for specific items: wood for the altar fires, incense, the golden vessels used in the sanctuary, burnt offerings. The system was organized, labeled, and administered. And it was administered by the priestly and scribal class, the same class Jesus had just finished condemning. To understand what kind of institution this was, you have to set aside the image of the temple as purely a house of prayer and look at its economic reality. The Jerusalem temple in the 1st century was the dominant financial institution of Judea. It held extraordinary reserves of gold, silver, and bronze accumulated over centuries of tithes, taxes, donations, and bequests. It controlled the currency exchange that was required before worshippers could purchase sacrificial animals or pay the temple tax. The money changers Jesus would drive out earlier in the same week were not a minor inconvenience, but a mandatory step in the financial mechanism of worship. It administered the agricultural tithes that fell on farmers and landowners across the region. It managed a workforce of priests, Levites, scribes, and administrators whose livelihoods depended on the continued operation of the system. The priestly families at the top of this structure were, by any 1st century standard, wealthy. Archaeological work in the Herodian upper city of Jerusalem has uncovered the remains of mansions, large, elaborately decorated homes featuring mosaic floors, frescoed walls, and multiple ritual baths, belonging to the high priestly class. These families lived in comfort that was qualitatively different from the daily experience of the widows, farmers, and day laborers who were obligated to support the institution that supported them. Into this system, the widow drops 2 lepta. A lepton was the smallest coin in circulation in 1st century Palestine, a tiny bronze piece whose purchasing power was so minimal that it was rarely minted in large quantities because there was almost nothing it could buy on its own. The standard conversion puts it at 1/128th of a denarius. A day laborer in a parable Jesus told earned 1 denarius for a full day's work in the fields. The widow's 2 coins together were worth approximately 1/64th of a single day's wage, the equivalent of roughly 4 minutes of a working person's daily earnings. They were not nothing. They were everything she had. But in the ledger of the temple treasury, they were beneath rounding. The financial burden the temple system placed on people of her economic standing was not incidental to its operation. It was structural. The half-shekel tax was proportionally far heavier for the poor than for the wealthy. The cost of the sacrificial animals required for various rites of purification and worship fell on everyone, regardless of means. though the law did provide for substitutions in cases of extreme poverty. The tithes on agricultural produce affected smallholder farmers who were already surviving on narrow margins. For a widow with no income, no property, and no male household member to absorb these costs, the obligations of the temple system were not spiritual uplift. They were extraction, dressed in the language of covenant faithfulness. She has been formed by a lifetime of instruction to believe that giving to this institution is her duty, her honor, her connection to the God who she trusts is watching. And God, in the person of Jesus, is watching. He is sitting across from the treasury chests in the court where women worship, observing the entire theater of giving, the loud coins, the wealthy donors, the visible performance of religious obligation. And then she comes, and she puts in her 2 lepta, and the sound they make entering that narrow metal throat is almost nothing. And Jesus calls his disciples close, because what he is about to say has nothing to do with how much she gave. It has everything to do with what kind of place just received it. She has no name. Mark gives her none. Luke gives her none. She enters the narrative identified only by 2 facts. She is a widow, and she is poor. She drops her coins, and she is gone. She does not speak. She does not hear what Jesus says about her. She does not receive healing or restoration or any word addressed to her at all. In the traditional reading, this anonymity has often been treated as part of her virtue. She represents the unseen faithful. She is every humble believer who gives without recognition. Her namelessness is her universality. But there is another way to read the absence of her name, and it is less comfortable. She is a specific person in a specific situation of genuine precariousness, and the story has used her condition without ever addressing it. She is seen by Jesus and then passed over by the text. That tension is worth sitting with before moving on. To understand who she actually was, not as a symbol, but as a person embedded in a specific social world, you need to understand what widowhood meant in first-century Judea. In the ancient Mediterranean world, a woman's economic survival was almost entirely organized through her connection to a male household. A daughter belonged to her father's house. A wife belonged to her husband's. The property, the legal standing, the social network. All of this was mediated through the male head of the household. When a husband died, that structure collapsed. What remained depended on whether there were adult sons who could assume the role, whether the husband's family was willing and able to absorb the widow into their household, and whether there was any property to inherit and the legal knowledge to hold on to it. For a widow with none of these supports, no sons, no property, no family network, the situation was dire in a way that modern Western readers have to work to imagine. She had no income in a world without wages for women, no legal standing to advocate for herself in a world where courts were administered by men, and no institutional recourse that did not run through the same religious and legal system that her vulnerability made her easy prey for. The Torah's commands to care for widows, Deuteronomy's repeated insistence that God defends the widow and the orphan, Exodus's warning that God's anger burns against those who afflict them, existed precisely because widows were so structurally exposed that only the force of divine command stood between them and total exploitation. The commands were necessary because the exploitation was normal. The prophets understood this and named it repeatedly. Isaiah indicts Jerusalem because its rulers fail to defend the widow and the orphan. Isaiah 1:23. Jeremiah lists the oppression of the widow among the defining sins that will bring judgment on the city. Jeremiah 7:6. Ezekiel places the wronging of the widow alongside the shedding of innocent blood as the crimes that make Jerusalem a city deserving destruction. Ezekiel 22:7. Zechariah, Malachi, Job. The figure of the exploited widow runs through the entire prophetic tradition as one of the clearest signs that a society has lost its moral bearings. When widows are being consumed, something has gone fundamentally wrong at the center. Jesus knows this tradition. He is steeped in it. When he condemns the scribes for devouring widows' houses, he is not introducing a new category of sin. He is placing himself explicitly in the line of the prophets, using their language and their moral logic, pointing at the same target they pointed at for centuries. And then, in the very next scene, he watches a widow come to the treasury. What makes the scene so quietly devastating is that she comes willingly. No one forces her hand at this moment. There is no scribe standing over her demanding the coins. She has come to the temple to give, because her religious formation has shaped her to believe that this is what faithfulness requires. She has been taught, presumably across a lifetime, that participation in the temple cult is her covenant obligation, that giving to the treasury is an act of worship, that whatever she has is owed in some measure to the God she trusts. And she trusts. That is unmistakable in her action. She is not being dragged to the treasury. She gives freely, out of genuine devotion, to an institution that has been consuming people like her for years. This is what ideological formation looks like when it reaches completion. The system does not need to stand over her with a demand in its final transaction with her. It has already done its deeper work. It has shaped her conscience, her theology, her understanding of what God requires, to the point where she does voluntarily what the system would otherwise have to compel. The scribes do not need to be present at the treasury chest to benefit from what she drops in. The long years of religious instruction have made their demand unnecessary. She gives because she believes. And what she believes has been constructed, in significant part, by the men Jesus has just finished condemning. Jesus does not stop her. He does not call out to her, does not intervene, does not redirect her coins. He watches. And that watching, the watching of someone who has just said in public that the institution she is giving to consumes women like her, watching her give it everything, is not the watching of a teacher about to praise a student. It is the watching of someone who sees a terrible thing happening and wants the people around him to see it too. He calls his disciples. He says, "Look at this." He names the ratio and the word bios. And then the text moves on without her, as if she has fulfilled her function. But in the lament reading, her function is not to teach us how to give. Her function is to show us what the system produces. A person with nothing left, formed by genuine faith, giving the last of a life to an institution that will be rubble within a generation. She is not a model. She is a witness. And Jesus, who sees her when no one else does, is grieving on her behalf. The widow's coins have barely settled in the chest when the scene shifts. Jesus leaves the temple, and one of his disciples, overwhelmed apparently by the sheer physical scale of the place, looks up at the walls and says, "Teacher, look at these stones. Look at these buildings." It is the response of someone who has just walked through a structure so massive, so finely constructed, so obviously permanent, that the natural human reaction is awe. The temple complex Herod had rebuilt and expanded was among the most impressive architectural achievements in the ancient Mediterranean world. Its retaining walls were built from limestone blocks, some of which weighed hundreds of tons. Its courts were vast. Its colonnades were grand. Standing at the base of it and looking up, You felt the weight of something built to last. Jesus does not share the feeling. His response is immediate and total, and it is one of the most arresting sentences in the Gospel record. Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. This is not metaphor. Jesus is not describing a spiritual condition or a theological abstraction. He is making a specific, concrete, historical prediction about the physical structure his disciple has just marveled at, and the prediction was accurate. In 70 CR, roughly 40 years after this conversation, Roman forces under the general Titus besieged Jerusalem, breached its walls, and destroyed the temple. The destruction was catastrophic and total. The temple has not stood since. What remains on the Temple Mount today are retaining walls from Herod's platform, the foundations, not the sanctuary itself. Every stone of the building the disciple admired was eventually thrown down, exactly as Jesus said. The positioning of this prediction in the narrative is not incidental. It is the sentence immediately after the widow's offering. Mark doesn't insert any material between the widow giving her last coin and Jesus predicting the temple's destruction. The sequence is deliberate. She gives everything to the temple, and the next thing Jesus says is that the temple is finished. This is the bottom piece of bread in the sandwich identified in the previous chapter. The outer frame that closes the structure around the widow's offering and shapes its meaning from below. Think carefully about what this sequence requires of the traditional reading. If Jesus is praising the widow for giving everything to the temple, and then in the very next moment predicts the temple's total destruction, then the praise and the prediction exist in serious tension with each other. He would be celebrating a gift to an institution he is about to announce is condemned. He would be holding up a sacrifice as worthy of admiration, while knowing the recipient of that sacrifice has no future. This is not impossible. There are ways to construct a theology in which giving to a doomed institution is still spiritually meritorious. But it is strained. It requires the praise and the condemnation to be in separate compartments that do not affect each other, which is precisely the compartmentalization that the Mark and Sandwich structure refuses to permit. The lament reading has no such tension. If Jesus is grieving the widow's situation, pointing to her as the tragic endpoint of a system that consumes the poor, then the prediction of the temple's destruction follows naturally. He has shown his disciples what this system does to people like her. He has named the ratio of her poverty, and then he predicts the destruction of the whole apparatus. The trajectory is coherent. Here is the human cost, and here is the judgment coming for the institution that produced it. What follows the prediction is the Olivet Discourse, the extended passage in Mark 13, where Jesus describes the coming tribulation, the signs that will precede the end, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the arrival of the Son of Man. It is one of the darkest and most urgent sections of the Synoptic Gospels. It speaks of wars and rumors of wars, of nations rising against nations, of the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not, of unprecedented suffering, of the elect being gathered from the four winds. It is not a gentle pastoral teaching. It is an eschatological warning delivered with unmistakable gravity. This is the passage that follows the widow's offering in Mark's Gospel. Not a sermon on giving, not a teaching on stewardship, not a commendation of sacrificial generosity expanded into practical instruction. The offering is followed by rubble, by suffering, by the shaking of the powers of heaven. The interpretive arrow of the surrounding text points entirely in the direction of judgment and loss. There is also a theological question that the traditional reading has never answered satisfactorily, and it deserves to be asked plainly. What kind of God would watch a destitute woman give her last 2 coins to a corrupt institution he was about to destroy and respond with praise? What does it say about divine character if the appropriate response to that scene is well done, give like her? It says that God values total self-depletion as a spiritual virtue independent of the wisdom of the giving, independent of the worthiness of the recipient, independent of whether the giver has anything left to live on. It says that the poor are most pleasing to God when they are most emptied. That is not the God of the Exodus, who hears the cry of the enslaved and intervenes. It is not the God of the prophets, who demands justice rather than sacrifice. It is not the God Jesus describes elsewhere, a father running toward a returning son, a shepherd leaving 99 to find one lost, a God whose kingdom is oriented toward the restoration of the broken rather than the extraction of their last resources. The temple that received the widow's coins was destroyed within a generation. Jesus knew it was coming when he watched her give. The question of whether he was praising her or mourning her is also, inescapably, a question about what it means to give everything to something God has already marked for judgment. The lament reading says, "This is a tragedy. The institution failed her, and it is going to fall." That reading asks more of us than the praise reading does, but it is the one the text, read whole and in order, demands. If the lament reading is correct, and the evidence that it is has been accumulating steadily since chapter 3, then a natural and unavoidable question follows. How did the church manage to read this passage the wrong way for 2,000 years? The answer is not flattering, but it is important to understand, because the mechanism that produced the misreading is still operating. It did not stop in the 1st century. It did not stop at the Reformation. It is at work right now in the way Scripture is selected, framed, and preached in communities around the world. The early church was building. In the decades and centuries after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the movement he started was expanding rapidly across the Roman world, planting communities in cities from Jerusalem to Rome, developing organizational structures, appointing leaders, constructing buildings, and establishing the financial systems needed to sustain all of it. Communities needed resources, leaders needed support, mission required funding. The question of how to motivate ordinary members, many of them poor, most of them without surplus, to contribute to the life of the institution, was a constant practical concern. In this environment, a text that appeared to celebrate total self-giving to a religious institution was extraordinarily useful. The praise reading served the institution's needs in a way the lament reading simply did not. Institutions do not need to conspire to favor readings that benefit them. They simply repeat and amplify and stabilize those readings until they become invisible, until the reading stops feeling like an interpretation and starts feeling like the obvious meaning of the text. This is the process that locked the traditional reading in place. It was not dishonesty, it was selection. Generation after generation of preachers, commentators, and teachers encountered the widow's offering, read it without the surrounding context, found a powerful and emotionally resonant lesson about sacrificial giving, and passed that lesson on. It matched what they had been taught. It matched what the institution needed. It matched the emotional grammar of the story as they received it. There was no incentive to dig deeper, no reward for noticing the scribe's passage 6 verses back, no institutional apparatus that would have amplified a more uncomfortable reading. The lectionary is one of the most concrete expressions of this process. In both Catholic and mainline Protestant traditions, the lectionary is the system for assigning scripture readings to specific Sundays across the liturgical year. It is how most Christians who attend worship regularly encounter the Bible, not by reading it front to back, but by hearing selected passages read aloud in a sequence determined by the liturgical calendar. The widow's mite is assigned its own lectionary slot, separated from the scribe's passage. When the lector stands and reads on the Sunday this passage appears, they begin at Mark 12:41. They do not read Mark 12:38. The condemnation of the scribes is in a different week, in a different context, or not read at all. The lectionary performs the decontextualization automatically, structurally, every single year for millions of listeners. They never hear the two passages together. The isolation is built into the system. This matters enormously. For the vast majority of people in the pews, the Bible is not a book they read continuously from cover to cover. It is a collection of passages they hear in worship, in bits and pieces, curated by a tradition. When a tradition consistently presents the widow's offering without the scribe's condemnation, it is not being malicious, but it is being formative in a specific direction. And that formation accumulates over decades into the settled conviction that the widow is a model of giving, a conviction so deeply embedded it feels like received truth rather than an interpretive choice. The corrective challenge came most forcefully from outside the mainstream tradition's center of gravity. Feminist biblical scholars and liberation theologians working in the latter half of the 20th century brought a different set of questions to the text. Instead of asking what the widow's action teaches about giving, they asked what was happening to the widow. Instead of asking what spiritual lesson her sacrifice models, they asked whose interests were served by telling her story this way. Elizabeth Schussler, Fiorenza, one of the most significant New Testament scholars of the 20th century, argued that the traditional reading was itself a product of an interpretive framework that consistently centered the concerns of institutional religion and male authority, while rendering women as instruments of spiritual illustration rather than subjects of genuine theological attention. In that framework, the widow is always a vehicle. The lament reading insists she is a person. Addison Wright's 1982 article was the technical pivot. Published in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly, which is not a venue for ideological polemic, but for careful, peer-reviewed biblical scholarship, it laid out the structural and exegetical case in terms that required engagement on purely textual grounds. Wright was not arguing from political commitments. He was arguing from grammar, vocabulary, and literary context. His reading could not be dismissed as agenda-driven, because it rested on the same tools: Greek analysis, narrative structure, intertextual attention, that any responsible exegete would deploy. The field took notice. The argument didn't vanish. It has grown in influence in the decades since, even as the traditional reading has continued to dominate in most pulpits. The gap between the academy and the pulpit on this question is itself revealing. Many seminary-trained ministers who have read Wright, who have encountered the lament reading in their academic formation, continue to preach the traditional reading in their congregations. The reasons are not hard to identify. The institutional stakes of preaching the corrective are real. A pastor who stands up during a stewardship campaign and tells the congregation that the widow's mite is actually a story about exploitation, not generosity, has not made their job easier. The friction of correcting a beloved and deeply embedded text is high. The reward for doing so, in institutional terms, is low. And so the reading persists. Not because the evidence for it is strong, not because careful attention to the text sustains it, but because the same forces that produced it in the first place, institutional interest, structural decontextualization, and the inertia of inherited interpretation, continue to maintain it. Understanding how a misreading survives is the first step toward dislodging it. It would be easy, at this point in the argument, to conclude that the lament reading is purely a work of demolition, that it tears down the traditional interpretation without building anything in its place, that it leaves the widow diminished, stripped of the dignity the praise reading afforded her, reduced to a cautionary footnote in a story about institutional failure. That conclusion would be wrong. The lament reading does not make the widow smaller. It makes her larger. It refuses to compress her into a symbol and insists on the full weight of her actual situation. And in doing so, it recovers something about Jesus in this scene that the praise reading quietly erases. He is angry on her behalf. Read the scribe's condemnation again, this time not as background information, but as an emotional register. They devour widows' houses. That is not calm theological observation. Katestiusin is a verb of violent consumption. Jesus is not making a measured critique of religious professional ethics. He is furious. He is describing something that is happening to real people, women with no protection, no recourse, no advocate, and the word he reaches for is devour. He is talking about predation. And then he sits down, and the person who walks up to the treasury chest in front of him is a widow. She is the specific human being his anger was defending. She is the face behind the category he condemned. His observation about her is not made in the calm tone of a teacher illustrating a principle. It is made in the register of someone watching a harm he has just named happen in real time, in front of witnesses he has specifically gathered to see it. Look at what this system has done. She has given her whole bios. She has nothing left. That is not a celebration. That is grief wearing the face of a factual statement. The lament reading honors the widow more fully than the praise reading for this reason. It takes her situation seriously rather than converting her poverty into a spiritual asset. The praise reading, despite its emotional warmth, ultimately makes the widow useful. Her destitution is the mechanism of the lesson. The more thoroughly she is stripped, the more powerful the illustration. In that reading, her poverty is valuable precisely because it makes her gift maximally impressive by the ratio Jesus describes. She has to have nothing in order to teach us something. Her need is instrumental. The lament reading refuses this. It says, her poverty is not a spiritual opportunity. It is a wound. It is the result of a system Jesus condemned, and the appropriate response to watching someone give their last resources to the institution that produced that wound is not admiration. It is the kind of sorrow that demands accountability. This pivot from admiration to accountability carries real implications for how we think about giving, about institutions, and about what faithfulness actually requires. The lament reading does not say that generosity is wrong, or that giving to religious communities is misguided, or that the poor should keep everything they have. The Bible's case for generosity is built on far more than this one passage, and that case stands on its own. What the lament reading says is that giving must be evaluated in context. The relevant questions are not only how much and how proportionally, but to whom, for what purpose, and whether the institution receiving the gift is worthy of the trust being placed in it. These are questions the prophets asked constantly. Amos told Israel that God hated their festivals and their offerings, not because worship was wrong, but because the worship of an unjust society was a cover for injustice. Isaiah spoke for God, saying, I have had enough of your burnt offerings. Your incense is an abomination to me. Your appointed feasts my soul hates. And in the same breath demanded that the people seek justice, correct oppression, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. The offering without the justice was not a half measure, it was an offense. The standard for a worthy institution in the entire prophetic tradition Jesus consciously inhabits is not its grandeur or its antiquity or its religious authority. It is whether it defends the vulnerable or consumes them. Applied directly to the modern context, this framework generates a demanding question. Are there institutions today that function the way the temple did in Mark 12? Wealthy, religiously authoritative, trusted by ordinary and working-class members, using their giving to sustain an administrative structure that does not share the material vulnerability of the people supporting it, and deploying the widow's mite from the pulpit to encourage those people to give more? The question is not rhetorical. It is diagnostic. It is the question Jesus' action in this scene implicitly requires every generation to ask about the institutions it inhabits. This is not an argument against churches or religious communities as such. Many are genuinely faithful stewards, organizations where resources flow toward the people who need them, where the poor are served rather than extracted from, where the gap between those at the top and those at the bottom is narrow enough to honor the equality of the body. The prophetic framework does not condemn institutions categorically. It condemns specific institutional behavior, the devouring of the vulnerable, dressed up as religious administration. The test is not whether an organization calls itself a church. The test is whether it behaves like the temple in Mark 12, or like the community described in Acts 2, where no one was in need because those with resources made sure of it. What the lament reading ultimately restores is a more coherent and more demanding account of who Jesus is in this story. He is not a teacher collecting positive examples for a lesson on percentages. He is a prophet watching a system devour a person, naming it in front of witnesses, and connecting it to a judgment that is already on its way. He sees the widow. He sees what has been done to her. He does not look away, and he does not praise the institution that brought her to this point. He predicts its end. The Jesus, the one who grieves rather than applauds, who holds institutions accountable rather than commending their beneficiaries, is harder to manage than the one the praise reading offers. But he is more consistent with everything else in the gospel record, and he is far better news for people like the widow. Return to the moment of the summoning. Jesus sits across from the treasury, watches the widow drop in her 2 coins, and then calls his disciples to himself. Proskalesteis tous mathetas autou. He draws them close deliberately. He wants them positioned to hear what he is about to say. This detail, the specific, intentional gathering of the inner circle, is easy to read past, but it is one of the most important structural features of the scene. Jesus is not making a general announcement to a crowd. He is not addressing the woman herself. He is pulling the people he has been forming, the people who have been watching him, move through Jerusalem all week, and directing their attention at something specific. At this woman. At this moment. At what has just happened in front of them. In Mark's Gospel, this kind of deliberate summoning carries weight. There is a pattern across the narrative. When Jesus calls the disciples to himself with intentionality, it is because what follows is not incidental. He is teaching something he considers essential. He is shaping their understanding of something they have not yet grasped. The question is always the same. What does he want them to see? And the answer to that question depends entirely on what he says, which, as examined in chapter 5, is a ratio and a single devastating word, bios, and then silence. No call to imitate, no blessing pronounced, no instruction given, just the observation, sharp and still. For the traditional reading, the disciples are being shown a model. They are gathered to witness exemplary giving so they can understand that faithfulness is measured in proportion rather than amount. The lesson is clear and transferable. When you give from what it costs you, not from what you can spare. The disciples are students receiving instruction. The widow is the curriculum. Jesus is the teacher pointing at the board. For the lament reading, the disciples are being shown something else entirely. They are being made witnesses to the end result of the system Jesus has been confronting throughout his final week in Jerusalem. The week began with the entry into the city and the clearing of the temple. Jesus driving out the money changers and the sellers, quoting Isaiah and Jeremiah, accusing the establishment of turning a house of prayer into a den of robbers. It continued with escalating confrontations with the chief priests, scribes, and elders who challenged his authority. It included the parable of the wicked tenants, which the religious leaders correctly understood as directed at them. It included the woes against scribal hypocrisy that immediately precede the widow's arrival at the treasury. The entire week is a sustained prophetic indictment of the temple system and the people who run it. The widow's offering is not an interruption of that indictment. It is its culmination. This is what it looks like at the human level. This is the person who pays the price. Jesus calls his disciples close and says, "Look at her. Look at what has been done." And then something happens that Mark records with what feels, in the lament reading, like devastating irony. Immediately after the widow's offering, as they are leaving the temple, one of the disciples looks up at the massive walls and says, "Teacher, look at these wonderful stones, these wonderful buildings." He is marveling at the architecture. He is impressed. He has just been shown a woman who has been consumed by the institution behind those walls, and he is admiring the walls. This is not careless writing on Mark's part. It is precise characterization. The disciples consistently fail to understand what Jesus is showing them. They argue about who is greatest in the kingdom, while Jesus talks about a servant being the measure of leadership. They try to prevent children from reaching Jesus, while he says the kingdom belongs to such as these. They fall asleep in Gethsemane when he asks them to stay awake and pray. Over and over, Mark shows us disciples who are present for the teaching, but not yet transformed by it, who see the surface and miss the substance, who hear the words and lose the meaning. The disciple who marvels at the temple's stones in the verse after the widow's offering is doing exactly what Mark and disciples do, looking at the wrong thing. Jesus shows them a victim. They respond by admiring the victimizer's real estate. The juxtaposition is so sharp it has to be intentional. Mark is not recording a coincidence. He is showing us, with the economy of a writer who knows exactly what he is doing, that the disciples are still unable to see what Jesus sees. They look at the temple and see grandeur. Jesus looks at the temple and sees a widow's emptied hands. This pattern of disciple misunderstanding in Mark is often treated as a theological problem. Why does Mark portray the disciples so unflatteringly? But it also functions as a mirror for the reader. The disciples are not written as irredeemable or contemptible. They are written as recognizably human, as people who are well-intentioned, who genuinely want to follow, who have left everything to be in this man's company, and who still, repeatedly, look at the wrong thing. Their failures are not foreign to us. They are familiar, which means the scene in the Court of Women is not just about what happened 2,000 years ago. It is about what we do with what we have been shown. The disciples in that courtyard were given the same thing the reader of Mark's Gospel is given: a woman, a gift, an observation, and a context. What they did with it, marveled at the building, walked away impressed by the institution, is one possible response. It has been, for most of Christian history, the dominant one. But there is another response available. It involves looking where Jesus is looking, seeing what he sees, and refusing to let the grandeur of the institution distract from the person it has stripped. The disciples in the room are us. They always have been. The question Mark's Gospel presses, in this scene and in every scene where they fail to understand, is whether we will keep doing what they did, admiring the stones, walking past the widow, or whether something in what we have been shown will finally change where we look. Nothing in the corrected reading requires you to distrust the Bible. That point is worth stating clearly because it is the objection that surfaces most quickly when someone encounters an interpretation that contradicts what they have always been taught. If the traditional reading is wrong, does that mean the text was corrupted? Does it mean the church cannot be trusted to handle Scripture? Does it mean this story should be removed from the canon or treated with suspicion? No, none of those things. The text of Mark 12 is exactly what it has always been. Every word is where it was placed. The corrected reading does not require a single change to the Scripture itself. It requires only that you read more of it. Specifically, that you read the 6 verses before the 4 you have always been given, and that you allow those 6 verses to do what Mark clearly intended them to do: frame and interpret what follows. Reading the Bible in context is not a liberal agenda. It is not revisionism. It is not the project of people who want to undermine faith. It is basic interpretive integrity, the kind of care that every serious reader of any text owes to the author. When you read a passage, you read it in its literary setting, in its historical context, in the flow of the argument the writer is making. The context here is not ambiguous or distant or difficult to locate. It is 6 verses away, in the same chapter, in the same continuous scene. The interpretive instruction is built into the structure of the text. Mark gave us the frame. We chose not to use it. What changes practically if the lament reading is correct is significant and concrete. This passage should not appear on stewardship campaign materials. It should not be preached as a model for how to give. It should not be cited as scriptural warrant for encouraging people of modest means to give sacrificially to religious institutions. Those uses of the text are not supported by a careful reading of it, and continuing them after the evidence has been laid out is not faithfulness to Scripture. It is the opposite of faithfulness. It is using the text as a tool for institutional benefit while ignoring what the text actually says about institutions that do exactly that. This does not leave the church without a biblical foundation for generosity. That foundation is rich and does not depend on this passage at all. The early community in Acts 2 and Acts 4, where those with property and resources sold what they had and distributed it so that no one among them was in need. That is a model of giving. Paul's theology of generosity in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, where he is explicit that giving should flow from willingness and not from compulsion, that God loves a cheerful giver and not one who gives under pressure. That is a theology of giving. The prophetic vision of Isaiah 58, where true worship is described as loosing the chains of injustice, sharing your bread with the hungry, bringing the homeless poor into your house, That is a framework for what resources are for. The widow's mite does not need to carry this weight. Other passages carry it more honestly and more completely. What changes theologically is that the prophetic dimension of Jesus' ministry is restored to this scene. Jesus in Mark 12 is not a teacher collecting positive examples. He is a prophet in the line of Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah, watching a corrupt institution extract the last resources from one of its most vulnerable members and naming it for what it is. This is entirely consistent with everything else he does in his final week in Jerusalem. He arrives in the city and immediately confronts the temple's economic apparatus. He teaches in parables that indict the establishment. He answers challenges from the chief priests, scribes, Sadducees, and Pharisees with responses that expose the bankruptcy of their authority. The widow's offering, read as lament, fits this sustained prophetic confrontation perfectly. The widow's offering, read as praise, sits awkwardly in the middle of it, like an interruption. What changes hermeneutically, in terms of how we read Scripture itself, is perhaps the most important and most durable consequence. The move that produced the traditional misreading of this passage is not unique to this passage. It is a pattern. Take the verses that serve the institution's interest, separate them from their literary frame, amplify them through repetition until they feel like obvious truth, and discourage the kind of careful contextual reading that would expose the extraction. That pattern has been applied across the biblical text in ways that have caused enormous harm: to justify slavery, to subordinate women, to exclude the people Jesus consistently sought out and welcomed. The corrective is always the same. Read more, read carefully, ask whose interests are served by each reading, and give the literary context the authority Mark and the other writers clearly intended it to have. She deserves better than what has been done with her story. The woman in the court of women, unnamed, widowed, poor, who came to the temple in genuine devotion and gave everything she had left. She has been used for 20 centuries as a fundraising illustration by institutions whose relationship to people like her has often looked more like the scribes than like Jesus. Her poverty has been extracted twice, once by the system that left her with 2 coins, and once by the tradition that turned those 2 coins into a case for giving more to systems like the one that stripped her. The lament reading refuses both extractions. It sees her not as a useful symbol, but as a person whose situation is an indictment, whose trust was betrayed, and whose offering Jesus watched with grief rather than approval. What Jesus said right before the widow gave her coins was that men like the ones running this institution consume widows' houses. What he said after she gave her coins was that not one stone of this institution would be left standing. The offering in the middle is not bracketed by celebration. It is bracketed by condemnation and by the promise of judgment. That is what the text says. It has always said it. The only thing required to hear it is the willingness to read the whole passage in order, the way it was written, and to let the frame do what the author built it to do. The widow gave everything she had to something that was going to fall. Jesus saw it happen. He made sure his disciples saw it happen. He said, "Look." And for 2,000 years, we have been looking in the wrong direction, at the coins, at the gift, at the admirable ratio, instead of at the institution, at its record, at what it had already taken from her, and at the rubble it was about to become.